All right, so We're going to be chatting about the customization of GitLab managed apps. And for some background, we started talking about this because we wanted to customize parts of the Helm charts that we were going to install onto the cluster. Um, so I think that the last time we talked about this, and I just chatted briefly about it with Dylan, we wanted to let me pull up the links that I have on the doc. We wanted to do this then via GitLab CI, so we don't have to like customize the way that we installed or upgrade or anything. Basically, everything becomes a CI pipeline. So one of the things that we had talked about was that then at every level that we have a cluster, we'll need to have a matching repo that contains all the configuration of that cluster, right? So how do you so that's kind of the first thing that I had a question about. How do we picture that happening, and like how much involvement do we need from users to do this? So I would, well, yeah, I mean, let's talk about that first, and then I'll
Okay.
talk about the couple of ideas that I have there.
Right. So the first thing is that, strictly speaking, we don't need this, right? Because we can always just put a text box and things like that. So just to clarify for everyone, and also, so so we want this because we want to version control this as well, technically, and also
Right.
potentially there'll be a lot of files maybe for some use cases. So that's why we want to repo, because we don't want to have like massive amounts of text boxes. So the kind of, if we only have project level classes, then it's really easy. Then we can just, connect to the same project repo. But because we have group and instance classes, then things are a bit hard. So after a lot of thought, I've opened this issue. I'll link it to the chat. I believe this is a very incremental step to allow us to connect a cluster to repo. Just naming, we just need to name it correctly, and I call it admin level cluster integration. I could come up with a better name for it.
So when you say that the CI job needs to have cluster admin privileges,
Yes.
we're just talking about the variables basically, right?
Yeah, that's right. The kube token and kube config, right?
Mm-hmm.
If something's unmanaged, then it doesn't really matter too much. But if something's managed, we want to be able to have one repository where it has the admin privileges and all the other kind of tenants. So all the other projects just continue to have edit level privileges.
So what do you mean managed or unmanaged? Do you mean a managed or unmanaged cluster?
Cluster, yes. GitLab managed cluster. Yeah.
But does that make a difference when we're installing applications? I thought that only makes a difference when you're deploying your application to it.
No, it makes a difference when you run CI jobs.
Oh, when you run CI jobs, okay.
Yeah, yeah. And if you want to switch to running CI jobs to install apps, then yeah.
So what is the difference when you run CI jobs on an unmanaged cluster?
Basically, everyone gets the same connection, regardless. Everyone gets the token that was provided initially.
Right. So everyone gets cluster admin token.
Yes, essentially, yeah. If they put in a cluster admin token.
Okay.
So this concept of an admin level cluster is not really meaningful or particularly useful for an unmanaged cluster because they're already going to get an admin token.
Yeah, that's right.
Not that we wouldn't want to implement it. Might actually be easier for us to just implement it the same way and just say, well, it's just another project. It gets the credentials, whatever. But it just might be more of convention or more of a kind of UI convenience rather than an actual feature for an unmanaged cluster. For a managed cluster, it's important because otherwise they're only going to get namespace scoped variables. And this is the way they ensured they get cluster admin credentials.
Correct. Yeah.
So this proposal is super minimal and actually gets us a good bit of the way. The only thing after this, we need, in order to demonstrate value to users, is an example project to put in this, a templated project to stick in this repo, which shows you how to use GitLab CI to deploy some of your applications for you. For example, Ingress could be in there, one of the ones we start with. Could be an example of how to install an Ingress using GitLab CI rather than using our UI. Now, all of a sudden, you have an Ingress that you have complete control over and the ability to configure all the files that are in the repo if you want to change settings for the Ingress. If you want to redeploy it or uninstall it, you do that all through the GitLab CI YAML file. There'll be defined jobs for how to do an uninstall of your Ingress, and there'll be manual action jobs, and there'll be an upgrade will just be rerunning the pipeline. And every time you push to master, it'll trigger a pipeline that reinstalls it. The next level value add is, since this is a project with a repo in it, if you have multiple infrastructure operators in your company, they can use a merge request flow where they configure Ingress. Now, one infrastructure operator, they want to change Ingress settings for their Ingress, they can create a merge request and assign it to somebody else in their team. They can view the diff and say, this is what we're going to do to Ingress. They can merge it. As soon as it's merged, all of a sudden Ingress is upgraded, and they've got a version control history of how their Ingress is managed on the cluster.
That is really great. I really like that. I think the wrinkle I see is going to be how to make this intuitive, right? Like, how is the user going to find out all the stuff that they can do with this? But yeah, I guess just starting with documentation, and I don't have to optimize too early for that, but just a thought.
Yeah, I think naming also matters as well, because I don't think we can call it a level, admin level. It's very confusing.
Yeah, the title of this issue, I have to say, it threw me off. I didn't know what admin level meant, but what it means is that you're simply saying which is the repo that is holding like all the management for this cluster, right?
Yep. Yeah, something like that. I completely made the term up, so yeah. Cluster management project sounds good too. Yeah. And with this hierarchy as well, I think Graham from Infra was asking about how about a staging cluster? We can do a staging cluster as well, actually, if we wanted to. Just connect the staging cluster to the same project, and all of a sudden you could have merge requests going to a staging cluster, which is pretty cool. But that can come later. We can just run everything on master for now.
Yeah. So how would the CI job differentiate between clusters?
Using the environment name mechanism matching.
So whatever environment the cluster is scoped to, use that in the CI job, and that's how you make changes in that cluster.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. So say if you want staging, then you say environment name staging in your merge request jobs, review apps jobs. Sorry, we should call it review apps. And then if you want, and then there'll be a star for master. I think we can slice and dice this however we like.
Okay.
Can I ask a question just about the UI for managing applications in its current form? If we move to this way, are we still keeping that UI, or is because I saw a comment that says we just need to keep the runner installation to avoid chicken and egg from David. And I can't tell if the suggestion is that we're removing the installation of the other apps in favor of this new way, or am I reading it wrong?
We want to, at least I want to, but it's a long-term project potentially.
Yeah, I think that initially, like just to move forward, we'll need to have both, right? So the current GUI-based method will continue to work as is, and then as we start iterating on this method, then so one thing that I see may be confusing for somebody that's just getting started with Kubernetes is that we're asking them to give us a repo that holds the management, like all the configuration management for the cluster. And that may not know what that means or what they need to create or stuff like that. So for a beginner user, I can see that being confusing. So I could see like us creating that automatically for them. that becomes a problem when you're talking about like an instance level cluster, because where do we create it, right? Where do we create the repo that holds all that if we're going to do it automatically?
But I also
yeah.
wonder if like on cluster creation, we could have an advanced versus like a basic version. So we keep the UI portion for people who just want the basic, but maybe for people who want a more advanced cluster variation, we don't have the UI anymore. We just have the project.
Yeah, so I think that as we iterate, there's no reason why the GUI stuff, when you click on a button behind the scenes, what's happening is that it's triggering CI pipelines. Like we could map one to the other and just maintain one method.
Yeah, I think long term that's what we certainly can do. In terms of like, here's the beginner and the easy option is auto create it and we'll auto attach it as well. And then, or you can have a kind of option on create to say, I want to attach it to this cluster. Or you can even edit it as well and say, I've changed my mind. I want this different project and state. But in the beginning, I think this is like an alpha level feature where it's opt-in, and we'll continue to provide the GUI installation for now. And there's a kind of advanced kind of tab to say link a cluster managed project.
How do we generally do those opt-ins, Tori? Like, I would say that it's available for everyone, but maybe it's an advanced button that you click, and then we just have the instructions and the field to enter the repo that holds the configuration.
Yeah, I would imagine something similar to that as well. I had another question on your architecture doc, Tong. You say any project can only have one cluster associated to it. And then you say we may have to disable cluster integration, and I just didn't understand what that meant. So I was hoping you could explain it.
Okay, that's being superseded by this already, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, because previously I thought we needed to have an alternative mechanism to the environment YAML thing. But if we can live with reusing the environment CI YAML as well for this thing, then we can have any number of projects, any number of clusters for a project, I guess. Once we're clear about the hierarchy. So it's kind of superseded.
Okay, and then my other question was just, I watched the recording of the APAC video, which was super helpful, where you were all talking about infrastructure they usually want their own separate project for configuration that's different than the application code. So even for project level clusters, we would still want a method of adding a project to a project cluster. Is that correct? It's kind of meta, but I think that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool.
But there's nothing stopping you from specifying the same project, I guess. If I think about this correct. Am I right? Yeah.
It would be pretty strange if you
know.
specified the same
Yeah.
project, because you're going to get admin credentials and not namespace scope credentials, and you can only have one like production environment. I don't know.
For a project level cluster.
Yeah, for a project level cluster, I mean, you're just having one CI YAML file that was responsible for deploying your ingress and deploying your application. It might get a bit weird. Like, we won't have a way for you to say, here's the template of project we have designed in mind for cluster management, and you also have your application in there. I don't know, it could probably work. There's probably not a practical reason why.
Then if that's also an application that you're deploying and you need CI for it, then you have like both CIs mixed in this one project, like all the templates for the applications and then all the crap for your app, and it's just gets convoluted.
It is. Yeah. At that point, it's much more easier to just have your own project, have your own flow, and then just add an unmanaged cluster to your project, and then you can do whatever you like.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so initially, how do we deal with outputs? So let's say if through this method I install Ingress, then I just go to the logs of the CI pipeline to see what my assigned IP address is.
Yes, that's one way of doing it. Yep.
And then once we move that the GUI stuff is being driven by this, then we just keep doing the same thing.
It depends on how the information is needed by the user and also by GitLab, the application. So, for example, with the IP address, the GitLab, we can quite easily ask the user to do it copy paste. The only place where we use it is to use it as a nib.io string for the domain's external thing, right? As far as I know. So in that case, that's really easy. We can either document it and then eventually move it to have GitLab poll for that thing, like how we do for a common pattern is like the deploy boards. The deploy boards does the same thing as well. It polls for a certain thing, assuming we document something that we do as well. So that's the simple one. The complicated one is something like Prometheus or maybe JupiterHub, where GitLab needs some information from the application. We might need to have some sort of polling mechanism, really, periodically, to say, have you installed it? Have you installed the app yet? Have you installed the app yet? All right, is the information there? Is the information there yet? And then have some sort of reconciliation mechanism there. That makes sense.
Well, so how does it work today after I installed Prometheus? Are all the things queried when the user visits the relevant pages, or when just do we create the endpoints?
I think Prometheus is it's basically when you install the app. I think we need to talk to Monitor about this because I'm not expert at it. But as far as I know, when you install stuff, it installs the Helm application from Prometheus into the cluster, plus some few common rules, and that's it. So there's nothing that GitLab really needs from that, because GitLab queries, whenever GitLab needs to connect to Prometheus, it connects. It creates a whole new connection, so that's fine. Where we may
so what is the purpose of the polling then? Why would we need the polling?
To get information out from the cluster. In case of Prometheus, we don't have such information. So
Okay.
If we want, say, to poll, we want to poll, say, the IP address of the install ingress controller, then that's one thing to poll for. There might be other things I haven't think about yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you would poll after it has been installed, then to start polling.
Yeah, something like that. Or you can just periodically poll. It doesn't. I mean, there's many ways to slice this fish. The complicating thing about Prometheus is that Prometheus also has very deep integration. Like, I add an alert for this particular chart, and it then starts to do things, assuming that Prometheus is installed. Now, it gets a bit hairy because with the CI-based approach, we don't really know for sure something is installed or not. So we have to start thinking about those things as well. So Prometheus might be one of the harder things to shift to this new flow, really.
Yeah, so with this approach, we don't really know what's installed. So for this first iteration, say the user attaches their project and does their own thing, and then we have this other UI. What happens if they hit install on an application they've already installed?
Interestingly, we have patterns already for this, right? Like Knative, we did the same thing recently where we just look on the cluster to see if you've installed Knative, and then we make it look like it's installed in the UI.
So we can do that here as well then?
Yeah, there's no reason we can't iterate towards that. This idea that like your cluster, we're expecting you to deploy certain things on the cluster using our template. So we'll start looking for those certain things. And if they're there and they look right, we'll show them in the UI. It kind of actually
that makes sense.
GitLab, all the code that lives in GitLab will now just be code that looks for things in the cluster and shows them in our UI, and won't ever be about doing things to the cluster. All the doing things to the cluster stuff happens in GitLab CI, which is version controlled and much easier for the developer to see the logs for errors. The developer has much more control over what is done to the cluster. But much like deploy boards, we just say, look, as long as you do things to the cluster in a certain way that we expect, they'll be visible in our UI. And here's a template for how you do them to the cluster, much like auto DevOps. This is the template for how you deploy things to the cluster. And you can configure it as you like. There's just a few conventions we expect to see, and then all of a sudden it's revealed in our UI.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. The state until we get there, though, it may be confusing. So we have to make sure that it's alpha and say, hey, if you are installing through CI, you are going to have the option in the GUI to install it. But if it's already installed, you may get errors and stuff like that. But yeah, I think as long as we mark it alpha, that's okay. That's acceptable. I think it's funny how in New Zealand you have multiple ways to slice a fish. In the Americas, we have multiple ways to skin a cat.
Slice of fish might be a phrase I made up.
Okay. So I think that answers all the questions I had. They all seem to be accounted for. I'm sure that we'll come across things that are not accounted for, but well, so one question that I had is with auto DevOps, we deal with templates, right? So when we make an update to the template, the user automatically gets all the updates. Do you picture it working in a similar way here?
It has the same weaknesses as auto DevOps in that people can legitimately fork the GitLab CI and start doing things to it. Yes, in that we'll try to keep as much as possible out of the GitLab CI and in a kind of a Docker image that we control. So if we have updates to say the how we install things, it's done within the Docker image, and all the GitLab CI is doing just calling a binary to do things.
Okay. So we don't even need to have an explicit GitLab CI.yaml, right? It could just work like auto DevOps, where that's abstracted from the user, and all they need is the configuration files for each chart that they want to install on the cluster.
Potentially, yes. I mean, I
at first,
don't like
we don't need to do
implicit.
that.
I don't like implicit YAMLs as well. But yes, yeah. At first it could be just a simple a template GitLab CI for sure.
Okay. So if it's a template CI, we make all the updates in the image that we maintain. It doesn't matter if it's explicit. It could, that's, I guess, neither here nor there. I think that most developers and operators will appreciate the fact that it's explicit.
Yeah, and we also need a project template as well, I think.
Okay. So the project template holds all the, like, one file of configuration per each of the charts that we install.
Yeah, the default.
What about the updates to the chart? So let's say right now we have the update button or the automatic update. How would updates work in this case?
Updates would be the same. So if we bump the version, actually, I might need to take back having the project template. How do we update the project template? People need to update that. So we updates is the same. Someone just needs to bump the version. So
on the image that we maintain.
It could be on the image. It could be on the image that we maintain, I think, or it could be on the project repo. There's pros and cons to having that. So let me show you.
Yeah, because then it's a manual. It's a manual deal. Anytime you want to update, you have to change something in your repo, and you don't know if what you're changing is going to work or not, because the version that you're updating to may or may not exist.
Yeah. So I'll share my screen if you don't mind. Share. That's that one. managed apps. So I've got a folder of GitLab managed apps in the.
Could you share your browser only so it's not as small?
Oh, sorry. Stop.
Oh no, it's okay. I'm on a small screen. So I think it's only my problem. Thank you, Tom.
Okay, is that better? Okay, cool. So why is it not there? I'm confused. Oh, it's in branch.
Oh, so this is like proof of concept of this?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I have ingress and cert manager. Cert manager doesn't work yet because of the CRDs, James. And if they want to bump the version, oh no, not that one. Sorry. I'm using helm file, which is a pretty cool thing that automatically installs helm for you, and if there's a difference, it installs the difference. It's nice. So one way you could do it is that I go edit in my repo and I say I want version 1.2 now because I know it's
Sure.
there, and then we submit the change and CI runs for you. So that's one
Sure.
way to do it, and that's very explicit. Very controllable by the person installing it. They can choose whatever tempo they like. The issue is that we can't push updates to all the projects. It relies on people manually updating these things. So
for what it's worth, we've never been good at pushing updates to everybody anyway. It's generally caused more problems than it's solved. And the fact that this is based on a repo now, people can rebase on this. And I think that gives people a lot more power to say, I'm happy where I am, or I want to keep up to date with GitLab's features here. I think there might be ways we want to make it easier for people to keep up to date that doesn't involve a rebase workflow. Include CI template is one such way. But there might be a way that these YAML files could reference remote files as well, or we just make it easier through our UI for people to perform a rebase against GitLab's master. This is basically a button in our UI that rebases you on master, and if it's one possible option.
Yeah, I could see that the upgrade button does that. If you're going through the GUI, behind the scenes, it's doing that. It's doing rebase. But then somebody has to manually do something still.
Yeah, they already had to manually use upgrade buttons in our UI. And we did talk about plans where we might want to automatically upgrade applications for them, but it was always going to be problematic however we implement it, because upgrades have a chance of failing and breaking things. And
it makes it really hard to do upgrades, smooth upgrades, I think.
some upgrades require menu steps.
Yeah. And Helm seemingly doesn't help you at all anyway, so especially with the CRD stuff that we're hitting at the moment.
Okay. So manual updates for the time being, fine, that's fine.
I wanted to go back to the comment about like this being less intuitive. I mean, that was kind of like a possibility that this is a little bit less intuitive. I wanted to kind of quickly give my perspective that from speaking to infrastructure people about how they do their work, this will be very intuitive for our infrastructure folks. This is how they intuit cluster management. People doing DevOps workflows will find this intuitive. It will be not as easy as our UI was in terms of guiding you, but we consistently got feedback about the opacity of what's going on there. Like people are like, what are these GitLab managed apps doing? How do I configure them? How do I uninstall them? How do I debug when they're broken? None of those things were intuitive for users. Like it was like, yeah, if it all worked perfectly the first go and you never had to change anything, great. But people always wanted to change stuff.
This is definitely better for the power user. If you're just getting started with Kubernetes and charts and stuff, if this is the only way you have to do things, it would be not a great experience. But for the operator that's a power user of all this stuff, this is, I would argue, much better way for sure.
Would we have it so that whenever you create a cluster, it's always associated with a project? Like maybe it would be associated with our default project that all the other ones would be based off? I guess it's kind of like leading from, we were saying that maybe we'd create this repo for you, but couldn't you just link it to a project that, like a GitLab namespace project?
Yeah, I think that that's what Tong is saying, that initially the user will have to manually put in that, and we won't create it automatically for you.
No, the CI aspect, though, like what it's going to run under CI. It's going to run the CI as a GitLab group. It's going to be kind of weird, though, James.
Yeah, that is weird. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think we can keep thinking about how to push like up. If we can have a default version, and then people are allowed to override it and things like that. So, for example, this version could be a variable, and we can have the variable set in the Docker image, but then people can override it in their projects if they want to as well. I mean, that's definitely one way to go for sure. And also, oh, no, not that one. So that's the helm file that just defines a few things. And then there's the value YAML file, which is the values that we currently have inside GitLab. Again, there's no reason that this can't be inside the Docker image as well, the default ones. And then people are welcome to define another values.yaml that will override any of the defaults here. And that will make it easier for us to push updates to the default values, I think.
I agree. Yeah. So if we use the values.yaml on the image, but if they have an explicit one defined, then we use that one. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. Helm does this for us, right? You just it will the later one will override bits that were defined. Like if I override this tag, it will just merge it in together, with the latest one being the most authoritative one. So yeah,
okay,
which is nice. I mean, I can show you some pipelines as well. So this is kind of a pipeline that installs Ingress. As you can see, oh yeah, Helm file detects there's no difference, so it just does nothing, which is great. And where's the upgrade? Helm file apply.
And when you installed it for the first time, then does it output like all the stuff that I was talking about, like IP address and all that stuff?
You have to query for that.
Query. You have to query.
Yeah, you have to query for that. Yep, that's okay. I mean, I've already made a job to output the external IP address, so that's here. That's kind of easy. It's really easy to make the jobs to output that. So you can have a job that installs all the different applications, and then you can have jobs that output different things as well. So yeah, and this is really nice as well. Helm file provides you a diff of what's going to change.
Yep.
As well. All the resources in this cluster. In this case, this is completely new, so it's everything. And then, it outputs the external IP right here as well. Oh, nice. And then it tells you, this is just an Helm. It tells you what things it has installed on things as well. Yeah, this is far more explicit as well, and rather than our Kubernetes error thing too.
Okay, so one thing that I can think about is that when you add a cluster, you have the ability to define or to provide this admin repo or the configuration repo for that cluster. So like a benefit for operators internally, especially, is going to be a way to do that programmatically as well. So via an API that I can pass in when I install the cluster, I can pass in the URL for the configuration repo.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. That's a good point.
So if the user chooses to do the project flow for this first iteration, Is it better
What's the
to
project
just,
flaw?
sorry, this issue here, the cluster project. You attach a project to your cluster, so you have your, am I frozen?
No. I was just
Oh.
what you were saying. So are you picturing that with an existing cluster, you could do this? I was picturing that you could only do it with a new cluster.
That's fine. I just mean like if the user is doing this advanced option,
Yeah.
then and they have a project that they're attaching to their new cluster, then should we just hide the GUI for applications? Because are they, I mean, if they go and hit install, even if we're able to detect whatever whatever applications they've installed via CI through their project administration project, then there may be like an application like Prometheus they didn't add, so they hit install there, and would it work and it'd be added to that project? Or should we just hide that GUI interface if they're doing this project flow?
I don't know. I would be tempted to keep it there because, as I was saying, it might be hard to port Prometheus to the CI version. Yeah, so I'll keep it there. It should
Yeah,
work.
like not all the apps are going to work from day one, right? So you may want to mix and match at the beginning. And if we mark the feature alpha, we're saying, if you try to install something that you already did through CI, it's probably going to fail. And I think that for MVC, we don't need to auto detect and gray out the install button. Like that could come as a follow-up. But yeah, I think that keeping both is fine. If people are signing up for this alpha feature, like they should know that, it has some quirks.
And bugs. And
Such an ugly word. There's quirks. There's some quirks.
Okay, so one other thing, the flip side is that information that, so we're talking about information that GitLab needs to pull. There's also information that potentially the cluster might need as well from GitLab. So I can't go very, but potentially there might be some. So
what
right now,
comes to mind when you think about that?
Maybe JupiterHub, I think. I don't know. I honestly don't know. Because right now, everything's installed by GitLab. Everything's provided by GitLab. So it's really easy to just pass variables in to the installation step and upgrade step. Now, the installation and upgrade is in a different CI job. So there might be some CI variables, new CI variables we have to create and pass to it. I don't know what, but I'm assuming CI variables is a legitimate way to pass information to jobs. So,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, a lot of the like things like JupiterHub needs the host name, right? These things can go in CI variables that get passed that the JupiterHub job expects. Ideally, we'd be encouraging people to version control it though, because the same thing we learned about having too much configured in CI variables when they weren't secrets or anything that really needed to be in CI variables, it makes it harder for users to kind of track what's going on. It just becomes like 100 implicitly named variables that you have to know, and then keeping those up to date if you lose them is kind of problematic. So we'd encourage people to set the host name of their Jupyter instance in the values.yaml file, or if we wanted to use CI variables, we'd encourage them to put it as a variable defined in their CI YAML rather than defined through GitLab's UI.
In their CI YAML. So
you need to stick variables in there. So
yeah, that's what I would think, that the easiest way, instead of you having to search through files and insert it in the correct line of the file and stuff like that, you could just do it as a CI variable in the settings of your repo. Like JupiterHub URL or Knative URL or
we may be getting
cert
ahead of
manager
ourselves,
email
though,
address.
we may want to decide like on a case by case basis. Like we have all of these options, and we should figure, you know, when we get to the specific applications, we can do that. There could be 100 other ways we could tackle this. Like if we want to have a UI that guides you, it could just point you. The UI could say, "Or you're trying to install JupiterHub, go to this file to edit this line," and that's how you do it. Or we could, yeah, have them all already pre-filled.
How would the UI know which app you're trying to well, yeah, I guess when we get to the point where the GUI is being driven by all the CI stuff, we can do that. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
What about, so what about runner? So in order to do this flow, you need to install runner, correct?
You need to have a runner available for this to work.
So
that's right.
does that mean
you don't need to install it on your cluster?
But you could, right?
You could, sure.
So that would, okay. So helm and runner would be, I'm just thinking, those would need to still be like within the flow if they were going to use a cluster runner.
Well, to install helm, I think you need a runner. So I think runner.
Well, all the applications are disabled until you install helm tiller. So that's what I was thinking of.
But how can you install helm if you have no runner to run this on?
I don't know.
You can't.
How?
Right.
So then
that's an
we're
interesting
changing
problem.
this flow, or?
Well, I guess that we're going to have runner available the old-fashioned way. Well, no, actually, yeah, you need helm no matter what. And if to install helm, you need a runner.
We can have helm tillerless, so that's what I'm doing in my CI jobs. I'm just using tillerless really, and helm comes installed. The client comes installed in the Docker image, so that's fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So helm's a different issue. The issue with runner is that it's twofold. One is that if I have no shared runners and the only runner I can get access to is the cluster runner, then it becomes a truly chicken and egg problem. And the second thing is that, as Dylan pointed out, it would be kind of weird or might have side effects if we upgrade the runner using the runner. Not sure what will happen there. So,
I imagine the job will break if the runner is being like the runner manager is being restarted and upgraded while a job is running. I don't know, maybe it's particularly designed to be resilient against that, but it could very plausibly break the job.
I think that it's a reasonable constraint for the alpha of this feature to be available, like to have a runner attached to your project to be our requirement. That's fine. And then we deal with the runner in cluster runner in a subsequent follow-up, because yeah, it has a lot of edge cases and scenarios that we could run into.
Yeah, I believe we can solve it later.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, I think I covered most of that. Are there any other questions?
I think all of mine are answered. This is really cool. This is quite brilliant in its simplicity. Where was this idea 2 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty cool,
yeah,
but it might not work, so fingers crossed.
Okay. I think it may very well work, Tom.
Yeah, I think we have been talking about this for a year now, so it's pretty cool to do it. I've also linked to here a very interesting article, but really that's a kind of a philosophical argument that you can read in your own time. Yeah.
All right, I'll take a read after we're done here.
Mm-hmm, yeah, but that's more of a marketing thing, really.
Okay.
Cool. Do we have anything else?
That's it for, yeah, I think that's it for now.
Yeah, I'm good for now.
James? Is everything clear to you? Or?
I think it's pretty clear.
Cool.
I was just thinking it'd be cool if this would also support things like I guess it would because it's a custom CI config, right? So.
Sorry, I understood it.
I see it. It'd be cool if this would also support like Terraform, and I guess it would.
Ah, okay. I think that's a totally different project. Yeah, but yeah.
That's a good point. But
Well, like for example, Terraform has a Helm provider, so you could actually use
Terraform has a GitLab provider.
Yeah,
it would be cool to have this all part of the GitLab provider.
I think the GitLab provider is supposed to provide you with GitLab, so that might be strange.
The GitLab provider already has the ability to like add clusters at the project level to your GitLab project, the group level of the GitLab project. So maybe app management can be done through that as well, and it's just calling this. Don't see why not.
But the way that I see it, this doesn't really tie you to any specific technology, right? Because it's just another GitLab CI config, so you do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And maybe we have some conventions about what our UI pick up, but
Interesting. I'm using something different, which is Helm file, which kind of does something similar, I guess.
Huh. So, you know, an interesting thought that I just had is that the system group will soon begin working on an infrastructure as code issue that will assist dogfooding internally that requires a user to be able to install a GitLab managed app through the API.
I'm inclined to think their focus should be at a higher level than what we're doing. So they're going to be focusing on managing all of infrastructure, like creating new clusters and configuring subnets in a VPC and whatever else, right? They're using Terraform and configuring things like that. Our focus should be on managing an individual cluster. And in fact, the way this feature is designed is like your project will only be scoped to and understand the concept of managing the cluster that it's connected to. Infrastructure as code at a higher level, managing larger things outside of a cluster, can be what the other group focus on, and that may include creating clusters, right? Like somebody needs to create the cluster to begin with, and if they want that to be infrastructure as code, including all of the network configuration and everything else and permissions that come with creating a cluster, all those things need to be done at a higher level than what we can do. So I think they can focus on that, and we won't have too much overlap here. We just kind of have different objectives. We're trying to simplify, okay, once you've got a cluster, how do you keep all of the version controlled resources of your cluster configured somewhere? And they're thinking about how do I control my whole cloud data center and all of the resources, which may include creating clusters.
Yeah, we can talk about that more at length in a separate meeting, because I think it's worth chatting about, because that was spun out of a conversation that we had internally with the SREs, and them basically expressing that this was a manual part that they would like to eliminate in their process. They can already create the cluster, they can already add it to GitLab all programmatically through their scripts. But if they want to use the apps that are provided by GitLab, they still have to come to a GUI and install them. But yeah, we can talk about that more separately. But this was great. Thank you very much, Don, for taking the time of walking us through it. I look forward to this feature taking shape.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
All right. Thanks. See you.